Here's the truth that the scamming health gurus don't actually want you to know. You can lose weight and you can gain weight eating any diet. There are only a couple things that actually matters when it comes to making a good diet. I'm a big fan of Dr. Eric Helms's nutrition pyramid, and I believe it's good guidance for anyone looking to figure out what the big rocks of nutrition are. And in this series, I'm going to be breaking down each level of that pyramid. So by the end, you'll be able to spot all the BS you see on social media and figure out what actually matters. And you'll also be able to craft your own diet based on your goals and preferences. Without further ado, let's get into the bottom of the pyramid, calories. Whether your goal is to lose fat or gain muscle, from a pure physiological perspective, the most important thing is how much you're eating, your calories, or how much energy you are intaking versus how much energy you are expending. Time and time again, studies keep on showing that when calories are controlled for, macronutrient profile is not super important. It's energy intake that matters the most, especially for fat loss. So to start off, let's talk about how much you should be eating if your goal is to lose fat. Like I just mentioned, for fat loss, the single most important part is being in a calorie deficit. When I lost over 40 pounds, I did so with zero pharmacology, no exercise even. It was purely just from putting the fork down. Of course, this is never an approach I would recommend, not for a single person really. But the point I'm trying to make here is, yeah, it worked. I did nothing else you should be doing, yet I still got the result I wanted because I followed the golden rule of staying in a calorie deficit. Anyone who tells you that eating a certain diet or eating a certain food will just cause insane amounts of fat to just blow off your body, I would be extremely, extremely cautious of. The truth is that there is nothing like that, and they're trying to sell you a solution to a problem that has no easy solution. I was vulnerable and manipulated like this too. I was so desperate at one point that I even fell for the V-Shred scam. Yes, V-Shred. Now, surely there is definitely some nuance about certain diets working better for certain people, and I'm not claiming that that's not true. But what I am saying is, even if you were to only eat steak, if you eat more steak than your body can spend the energy on, you're going to gain weight. The same way if you literally only ate bacon, but you ate in a calorie deficit, despite eating all that fat, you won't actually get fat. So now we know that a calorie deficit is extremely important for fat loss. But how do we know whether or not we're in a calorie deficit? How do we figure out how much we normally burn? Well, there are two things you need to do before you can start your fat loss diet. Number one, you need to find your maintenance calories. And number two, you need to figure out what rate you will be losing weight at, or how much of a deficit you'll be going into. To find our maintenance calories, it's really easy to just plug our statistics into any one of the hundreds of online calculators. You can just literally search up like maintenance calorie calculator and you'll get 50, 100 results instantly. However, the number you get from this calculator isn't going to be perfect. And that's because there's a lot of individual minute differentiations between people just because of genetics or lifestyle or other factors. So what you can do is you can plug all your data in, you can get the calculated maintenance, and then you can eat at that maintenance for about a week. And if you gain weight, that means it was an overshoot. If you lose weight, well, you're already on your way. And if your weight didn't change at all, well, then the calculator was actually accurate. Keep in mind that even this more precise found number from our little experiment is going to be even more accurate than the calculator, but no matter how you figure out your maintenance calories, it's never ever going to be perfect because it's always changing just a little bit every day. Factors like how stressed you are, how well you slept the night before, how much you moved that day can all affect your metabolism and alter your energy expenditure. So even if you think you're spot on, you could be off by a small bit or maybe even a large amount. So really, this is just not something to worry about. It's just something you have to deal with. The fact is that it's variable. Things are going to change. With fat loss, it's not going to be linear because of these small changes. There's a lot going on underneath the hood. So now we figured out our maintenance calories, but now we need to figure out how much of a deficit should we be going in each day. And here's a really important relationship you need to understand between calorie deficits and fat loss. It's pretty much linear, and what that means is the steeper your calorie deficit, the more fat you're gonna lose. However, that doesn't just mean you should eat as little as possible every single day, and here's why. The less you eat, the harder it is to maintain for a long period of time. The smaller the deficit, the easier it is to maintain. Also, the larger the deficit you go into, the more risk there is of losing muscle mass. And finally, your metabolism will adapt to that low amount of calories if you just eat it long enough. Eventually, if you go from, say, eating 2,000 calories to only 1,000 calories, your body is pretty much going to become better at preserving energy because it's just used to getting less. So you won't be losing weight at the same rate because your metabolism is basically decreased. So, we don't want this to take forever, but we also don't want this to be so horrible that we just can't survive through it. So we need to find that balance. And here's what I would recommend to someone who's new to dieting. I would recommend starting off with a smaller deficit. Make sure that you can actually stick to something, even if it's not the most optimal or the quickest way. You're still making progress and doing other things like getting into the gym, learning how to eat, learning what foods to eat, learning everything you need to know about the span of health and fitness. That's a lot of information at once, and trying to learn all that while in a super steep deficit is just hard because you're going to feel not great. If you actually have a life and you have a family, you can't just easily take the hit from a super steep calorie deficit. What's going to come with that is, probably worse sleep, increased stress, increased hunger, increased irritability. It's just going to kind of suck the life out of you. And so even if you get super shredded and lean and look awesome, you might just feel horrible and the fun of life is going to get sucked out of it. Now, that doesn't mean that people who are more experienced with dieting can't go into a steep calorie deficit, or that anyone can't go into a steep calorie deficit. It has its time and places. For example, a mini cut, which is where for a shorter amount of time than a traditional diet, you'll go into a steep calorie deficit. And what this does is it pretty much allows the benefit of the steep calorie deficit, which is increased fat loss, and it takes away most of the downsides by keeping it in a very condensed time period. So, it's not like you're eating 800 calories a day or whatever your mini cut calories would be for 3 months. It's more like 3 weeks at most. So I keep talking about all this, small deficit, big deficit stuff, but what is a small deficit in numbers? And what's a large deficit in numbers? Well, there's another important variable I need to talk about before I can talk about how much weight you should be losing, approximately. The more fat you have on your body, the easier it is for your body to let go of that fat. For example, someone who is 30% body fat to start and loses weight and goes down to 20% body fat is going to have a much easier time cutting down quicker and more efficiently, without risk of things like muscle loss or diet fatigue or increased stress or other things of that nature. However, someone who starts at 20% body fat and goes down to 10% body fat is going to have a much harder time doing that. And this is in part because of the level of leptin in your bloodstream is going to decrease, the main satiety hormone pretty much, because your fat cells secrete it, and when there's more of it in your bloodstream, you have more fat and you feel more full. So it's easier to eat less. You can think of fat kind of like money in a way. If let's go back to the example before of 30% body fat, you could say that person has $300. If you have $300, you could throw away $100 and still feel pretty good knowing that you have $200 left. However, if you had $200 and now you only have $100, Well, you just lost half your money. That's a lot more than, a third of your money. You're going to be less willing to throw away that money, and it's going to be harder to throw it away. As a general rule of thumb, I would recommend losing about 1 to 2 pounds per week on average for most people. And because there's approximately 3,500 calories in a pound of fat, this is about a 500 calorie deficit a day, give or take. Of course, if you are on the bigger side already to start, like if you were the 30% in that example, you could safely lose more than 2 pounds perhaps. But for most people who are just an average weight, maybe trying to, just get a bit leaner for the beach, 1 to 2 pounds is generally a good rule of thumb. If you like percentages more, for perhaps a bit more of an accurate number, I would recommend losing about 1 to 2% of your body weight per week. Probably 1% if you're already leaner, and 2% if you're on the heavier side. So if you were 200 pounds, this would work out to 4 pounds per week. And if you were 100 pounds, this would work out to probably about 1 pound per week. So now let's talk about the muscle gain diet. The muscle gain diet is pretty much the inverse of the fat loss diet in most ways, and it has two distinct properties. You have to eat in a calorie surplus to gain weight over time, and the second most important property is that unlike a fat loss diet, which has a linear relationship between the size of the deficit and the fat loss, there is not a linear relationship between the amount of surplus and the amount of muscle gained, which means you can only put on so much muscle in any given day, week, month, or year. You cannot force feed muscle like you can force starve fat loss. Before I talk about what rate you should be gaining weight at if your goal is to gain muscle, I wanted to touch on why gaining weight in the first place is even important. And I mean, if you think about it, let's say you weigh 130 pounds right now and you just started lifting. There is no way you're ever going to reach 150 pounds without gaining weight, right? And if you don't get to 150 pounds, you won't ever reach your maximum muscle potential. You can't take 130 into 130. Those extra calories do some pretty cool things in your body. They give you more energy for training, they supply more micronutrients as well, and maybe most importantly, they just allow your body to actually focus on building new tissue as opposed to simply maintaining homeostasis. So when you eat in a surplus, and of course the amount matters, and I'll touch on that more, your body can turn that extra food into new tissue instead of just repairing the tissue it already had. Now, this doesn't mean that if you don't go into a surplus, it's impossible to gain muscle. At the end of the day, again, what really matters is that training stimulus, but keep in mind, it's just going to be easier and probably faster for the majority of people to go into a surplus. But there are, of course, nuances. If you're new to training, you do not have to go into a surplus. And if you are already on the heavier side, you can also probably gain muscle without going into a surplus. This is known as body recomposition, where you pretty much, lose fat and gain muscle at the same time. But I mean, if you're like 10% body fat and you want to put on more muscle and you're expecting to do that by body recomposition, I just don't really see that as a valuable take. It's just, going back to that money example, you don't have very much money to spend and your body does not want to spend it. Here's another important part about the muscle building diet that is just, unfortunately, an inevitable side effect of it. When you're on a muscle gain diet, you're going to gain some fat, okay? Of course, it can be controlled, and usually the people who gain insane amounts of weight, like a dreamer bulk where you just see food and eat food, that can be controlled for. However, it is almost impossible to gain no fat at all simply because of the fact that if you try to eat a calorie surplus so small that you gain purely muscle, it's impossible to track. Now, this is not a scientific number. I'm simply saying this for the sake of example, but let's say eating a calorie surplus of 50 calories gives you the perfect ratio of only muscle and zero fat gain. But 50 calories, that's so minute, that's so easy to mistrack, that's so easy to be inaccurate from food labels, that's so easy to be altered just from any possible movements throughout the day. Like, let's say you normally eat 2,500 calories and, you have the same amount of movement every day, everything is the exact same. But today you decided to walk your dog for an extra 10 minutes. Now your 50 calorie surplus is gone and you're not gaining much muscle. So yes, it does suck. You probably are going to have to put on some fat. Of course, like I mentioned before, it can be controlled, but that is just the way you are going to be able to consistently make sure you're actually in a surplus. Because remember, such a tiny surplus is just going to be so minute and hard to track. So how do we make sure that fat gain is kept in check while muscle gain is at pretty much its highest point possible? A simple heuristic you can use for this is you can take the amounts I talked about in the fat loss dieting part and simply multiply that by 4. So instead of losing 1 to 2% of your body weight per week, you should be gaining 1 to 2% of your body weight per month. So this pretty much means in a calendar year, you should be gaining weight if your goal is muscle gain for like 9 out of the 12 months of the year. And then the other 3, you can go into a cut, and then guess what? The next 9 months, you're back at it. Now, another important variable to talk about when discussing your rate of weight gain or how big of a surplus to go into is actually your experience level with training. Of course, a calorie surplus has to go hand in hand with great training, but that's a topic for another video. Anyway, the less experienced you are, the more easily you can put on new muscle, so your body can take more energy and convert it into new muscle. However, the more experienced you are, the less muscle you are capable of putting on, right? It's that diminishing returns curve and it falls off. So you would think that the more experience you get, the more you need to eat to force feed muscle growth, but it's actually the opposite. The more experienced you are, the less of a calorie surplus you should be eating in. So as just kind of a simple heuristic for most people, eating above your maintenance around 150 to 400 calories will probably get you in these ranges, but you should calculate your own numbers to get a more accurate estimate. Very broadly speaking, I would say there is 3 main ways of going about tracking your nutrition. Level 1 would be no tracking at all. Level 2 would be hand portioning, and then level 3 would be using a calorie counting app. In 90% of scenarios, if you're serious about your goal, I would really not recommend going with option 1, which is no tracking, because people often underestimate how much food they eat, and they don't realize how many calories are actually in the food that they're eating. Again, I'll never forget the first time I realized how small a tablespoon of peanut butter is, or how small a tablespoon of salad dressing is. It's amazing how quickly some calories can add up without you having any idea. And you could even say the opposite of this is true as well. If you're someone who's trying to gain weight, but you naturally have a very small appetite, you could just be simply eating to your satiety signals, and you won't actually be eating enough to gain weight. And that's not to say that there's no point to this no tracking, intuitive eating approach, and I'm certainly no psychologist, but for most everyday people, or just people who have struggled with eating disorders in the past, intuitive eating can be a very good tool to build a healthy relationship with food. Now, level 2 is hand portioning. This is the one I would consider the 80-20 principle of calorie tracking. It doesn't take a lot of effort, and it'll probably get you most of the results. And the basic premise is that your hand is approximately proportional to the rest of your body. So you can use your hand as kind of a measuring tool for the different food groups, meaning protein, carbs, and fats. The best part about this approach is all you really need to do is figure out how many hand portionings of each macronutrient you need to eat, and then just eat that amount, because your hand's with you everywhere. You always have a tracking device. If you don't want to go all out with calorie tracking through an app, which I'll admit is very abrasive to most people's lifestyles, I think Hand portioning can be a very good happy medium between still being very conscious of your meal portions, but still not being so annoying that it takes up a lot of time in your life. So now let's talk about level 3, calorie tracking. And I think this is the single best way to go about achieving your nutrition goals because it's much more objective and it stops you from your emotions getting in your way. A lot of time when you just eat to satiety, things like emotional eating can take over and you simply start eating for pleasure instead of satiety cues. With level 2, hand portioning, certain foods can, of course, have different calorie amounts and that can disproportionately skew your results. But with calorie tracking, I mean, if you're weighing everything and you're tracking everything, it's the margin of error is going to be a lot smaller, and therefore it's going to be better for people most serious about their goals. I use calorie tracking as pretty much the sole tool to lose weight, and I'm using it again now that I'm gaining weight as an extremely useful tool. And I've been doing it for over 4 years at this point daily. So to me, it just feels like extremely natural. But I realize that for most people, it does not feel natural, and it is abrasive to your lifestyle. I've pretty much built my lifestyle around it, to be honest. But I get that for a lot of people, especially when you start, especially when I started, it was hard and it was annoying and it was tedious and it took a lot of time. But I will say that when I did start tracking, like I was talking about with that peanut butter example before, it's really incredible to just see how many calories are in the foods around you. And it actually tunes your brain and tunes your mind to become more satiated from foods that you know have more calories. Like, for example, if I had no idea how many calories were in a piece of cheese, I could probably eat a whole block. But I'm very conscious of the fact that cheese is rather calorie dense and has a good amount of fats and proteins in it. So I'm thinking in my head now, oh yeah, this is a lot of calories, I'm not gonna die anytime soon because I just ate this calorie dense food. So even if you don't like the abrasiveness to your lifestyle of calorie tracking, I would highly suggest, at least for some period of time in your life, tracking food very religiously because I think it will enlighten you and it will turn your eyes into kind of like food scanners where you get much better than the average person at guessing how many calories are in food. So even if you say track your calories for 3 months and then you never track them again for the rest of your life, that information from those 3 months is going to stay with you and it's going to help you on your health and fitness journey. And again, it seems like I'm just absolutely talking about how good calorie tracking is, but I want to bring up how it's not perfect either. It has its flaws like the other two systems. I mean, again, like the built-in calculators in the apps, they're never quite right. The amount on food packaging labels have margins of error. Unless you make every single meal you ever eat in your own home, there also comes to be the problem of things like restaurants where you don't know how much of each ingredient was used or even what ingredients were used. So all you can really do is guess like the other ones. What I'm trying to get at here is that calorie tracking is a tool. It's not something you should stick extremely religiously to, except perhaps in those first few months of you using it. So that just about covers it. Now you know how to find your maintenance calories, how to find how big of a deficit or surplus to go into, and how much weight you should be gaining or losing in an approximate time frame. As a final reminder, I wanted to say I know it's really easy to just be like eat more or eat less and you'll achieve your goals, but of course I know it's not actually that easy. I've been on both sides of this coin. I've felt like I've been eating my stomach for hours on end, just like sitting there crying, and I've also been so incredibly bloated that looking at food has almost made me throw up. So I get it. It's not easy either way, and either losing weight or gaining weight comes with its pros and cons. So that segments me into my final bit where I just want to talk about how adherence is the most important thing for diet. If you cannot stick to your diet for however long you need to stick to your diet to achieve your goals, it's not going to work out. And of course, a one-day slip up isn't going to ruin anything, The good thing about these long-term hard goals is that they take weeks and months or even years to achieve. So a single day in the grand scheme of things is not going to mean much. You can always get after it again tomorrow.